Hello, friends. How do trees access the internet? They log on. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. John had been my patient for months. I couldn't label him using official DSM codes, but he appeared to have what is known as Wendigo psychosis. At the time of my initial assessment, there wasn't any direct evidence that he tasted human flesh, although I could tell it was a significant preoccupation with him and suspected him in the creation of several recent grisly scenes. "Just admiring the artwork in your office," John said to me one day. He grinned, letting me see the teeth he filed down to fine points. "So much red. I wonder if we're alike, you and I." I swallowed nervously. I couldn't report his Wendigo psychosis to the authorities though, because I would be perceived to be just as crazy as him. I couldn't even say he's a cannibal, even though he's come out and said his greatest fantasy is to devour a person over the course of 3 days. There was no proof. "So much red," John repeated. "Like a sea of blood making its way to your kitchen table." He grinned again, seeming even more unstable. "This has to stop, John. Right now, there's no direct evidence linking you to the murders, but if you keep eating people, your actions will eventually catch up to you. You haven't reported to me yet." "No evidence." "No, I think it's because you like me. Deep down, you like me, David Morrison." "Why? Why the hell would I like someone like you? I can't prove it, but I know you are a murderer. Not just that, a monster." John put a hand admiringly to his heart. "You really think that about me?" "Yes, I do. I'd like to talk about your parents, John." My session with him ended a few minutes later, and I drove to the park, taking in the beauty of summer before heading home. My wife had gone on a business trip, so I had the place to myself. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. I popped on the TV. Hannibal was on, but I stopped myself from changing the channel. For some reason, I had become intrigued by monsters. For some reason I shook my head. The reason was clear. John. I put dinner in the oven, a chicken stuffed with carrots and onions. While that cooked, I decided to go into the basement, do some late spring cleaning. Turning on the light, I surveyed the pile of unruly boxes. A few cocoons struggled as they hung from the ceiling. Their inner cores were human, weak from neuroses or traumatic life events to the extent that they were willing to visit a lonely psychologist's house for free therapy. "You're happier this way," I said. "And you called me a monster," John replied for the cocoon of silk. I turned around, greeting John's sharp teeth and blood-red eyes. He looked like a droopy-eyed hunting dog. "Did you come to eat me, John?" John hesitated, then shook his head. "No. I'm here to learn from you. From the master. You've obviously found a perfect way to ensnare your victims. Teach me." So I showed John how I spun a spider's web from my own hands. I was afraid he would eat me at first, and even though he stared at me with those hungry, blood-red eyes, he left with a cocoon of silk over his left shoulder. The Wendigo told me later that he could give me the hunger, the fire in my gut which would illuminate the path of my soul. I asked who had sent him. He told me John did because he was so very grateful for the bundle of human flesh I gave him. "A gift for a gift?" the Wendigo said, disappearing into the basement gloom and leaving me alone with my thoughts. The winter season was upon us and droves of Wendigo spotters had descended upon our small town to try and get a glimpse of something that I believed didn't exist. It all started 2 years back when Billy Fisher brutally murdered his wife Jane and her 2 poor daughters. When he was arrested, he claimed in his defense that he was driven mad by some kind of beast that followed him home from the lake he was fishing on one night. It affected me and my wife greatly. We were neighbors. We had no kids of our own, so we looked after the girls whenever we could. We loved those 2 girls. We were close friends, and when he came and asked me for help, I honestly thought he was crazy. I wish I had listened to him. And ever since, the town has been besieged by conspiracy theorists looking to get a sight of something that apparently didn't exist. I was sitting down in the living room watching telly when I heard my wife scream from the kitchen. I ran in to find she had dropped the meatloaf all over the floor. Concerned, I asked her what happened. She seemed terrified. She told me she had seen something staring through the kitchen window at her. It had big red eyes, she said. I tried to reassure her it was probably one of those Wendigo spotters trying to get a picture of one of us locals. They have been known to do that. They come up here and think it's fair game to harass us and trespass on our land. After my wife calmed down, we decided to go to bed. I made sure all the windows and doors were shut tight. That night, as I tossed and turned, I awoke to find my wife missing from the bed. I could see my breath and the air was brisk. Someone had opened the bedroom window. I went to close it, and that's when I saw my wife standing in the back garden staring into the woods. I called her name, to no reply. I ran down the stairs, but all the windows and doors were still shut and the keys were still in the drawer where I had left them. Even though I had my housecoat on, it was still as cold as anything. It must have been below freezing, and my wife was just standing there in her nightgown. I called her name and she didn't even acknowledge me. I shouted at her and shook her till she came round, and eventually I got her back in the house and back to bed. The next morning she remembered nothing. At first, she didn't believe me. She thought I must have dreamt it. That was till I showed her the mud on her nightgown. I didn't blame her for being perplexed about the whole situation. It was totally out of character for her. Apart from chasing a few out-of-towners from my land, it was an uneventful evening. That night, before we went to bed, I made sure everything was double-locked and I hid the keys. Horrible nightmares filled my mind as I slept. I dreamt of a monstrous creature that stalked the woods behind my house. The creature walked upright like a human. But it wasn't human. Its legs were similar to that of a goat, but big and strong. It had big massive talons for hands. It had leathery, jet black skin with deep red scars covering his torso. Its head looked like a skinned goat's head. Its eyes glowed red and big towering antlers sprung from his back. As it stalked me through the woods, I could hear it calling me, but it sounded like my wife. I turned to see my wife standing there. As I walked towards her, she transformed into the beast. That's when I woke up. My wife wasn't in bed with me. The sheets were covered in blood. I felt searing pain all over my chest. I looked down and saw a load of deep claw marks dug into me. I heard a growl come from the corner. I looked to find my wife cowering. She was shaking while licking my blood of her fingers. She seemed delirious. She screamed at me to not come near her. She was hungry was all she kept on saying. Eventually, I calmed her down. Her temperature was through the roof, so I decided to call a doctor. When the doctor got here, I brought him up to the bedroom to my wife. I left them alone while I went downstairs to make coffee. As the coffee brewed, I heard a gut-wrenching scream come from the bedroom. Then the doctor came sprinting down the stairs screaming that she bit him, as he ran out the door, not even looking back. I sat with my wife and watched over her as she tossed and turned all night. She rambled on for hours about the woods and how hungry she was. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. When I woke the following morning, my wife was gone. After frantically searching the house, I found no sign of her except for a note that was left on the kitchen table. The only words on the note were "I love you." A few days after I reported my wife missing, the police called me into the station and showed me security footage that was taken the night before. 2 bodies had been found near the woods, badly mutilated, and my wife was caught on camera walking from the scene near the woods. I know my wife is out there somewhere in the woods. Maybe. I have seen the form she takes from time to time. Now I spend my days searching for a way to bring her home. The strange thing is, both my wife and Billy Fisher were Native American. Maybe there is a connection.